Well, good morning, everybody. Happy New Year's. If you don't know me, I'm Shawn. I get to work with our youth around here, and I'm excited to be here with you on New Year's, which means you made it. Holiday season, all the stresses, all the travel, Thanksgiving, Christmas, the family drama, you made it. And as a reward, you get to go back to work on Tuesday. Who's excited? Nobody. I did have one person cheer in the first service. I asked him about it after. He said he's retired. And I said, that's cheating. Yes. So it is New Year's, though, which has actually always been one of my favorite holidays. I have always really enjoyed it. And the reason being, I feel like it's a holiday, at least for me growing up, you got to just be. There were no expectations. Some years we'd celebrate it with friends, some years with family, some years we'd stay up till midnight, some years we would go to bed at 8 o'clock. It really doesn't matter. You can do New Year's however you want to. Speaking of which, how many of you are planning on staying up to midnight tonight? Okay, about half of you are staying up till midnight, which means most of you are like, I'm catching up on all the sleep I've been missing, and that is the right way to do it. It's New Year's. You can do it however you want to. You can just be, and I love that. I also know that coming off of the holidays, for many of us, even though there's probably been some vacation time, maybe as I say that, we're going back to work, you're like, oh, that's right. Oh, man, I need a vacation from the vacation before I go back to work. There's stress still eating you up inside, and because our culture is really bad at resting. So I thought we'd take this morning, this Sunday, that's just kind of right in between different series, right in between the holidays, the last day of the year, and just kind of lead into the new year with some talk on rest. Now, it's no secret that our culture is bad at it. If you did a Google search, books on rest or books on work-life balance, you would find thousands of books, and some of them are just phenomenal. And I would encourage you to look at them if you want. Some of them have helped me throughout my life. But it's no secret that we're just bad at resting. We just kind of work a lot. And when we're not working, we find something else to fill our time with. We're just busy people. We're in the top 15 nations on earth in terms of most hours worked, and that's just the normal jobs. I don't have to tell you that one of the things is that we're always reachable, right? On any Saturday that it's your day off, you can get a phone call and boom, you have to answer a question, or you have to go into work, or you have to do something that breaks apart the rest. Or maybe just at the back of your mind, something else happening, you're worried about what's going on. So you're not working, but you're thinking about it, so you're not resting your mind. Maybe you're on the couch eating Doritos and your body's resting, but your mind, your heart, your soul, it's not resting. I feel like it's also difficult because I think that the job market is perhaps more competitive than ever before. With this rise of remote working, which I think is a wonderful thing, but it does mean that when you're interviewing for a job, you're potentially competing with every other person on the planet for that job. Which means it can feel like, well, I have to perform to this level or I'm very easy to replace. And so we wind up with these crazy work-life balances just to eat, and it's crazy. At the same time, we get so much of our meaning from work. You know, life is built on several different pillars. You've got family, which is great. You got faith, which is great. You got friends, you've got hobbies, but you've also got work, and all these things are where we spend most of our time, and we get so much of our meaning and so much of our purpose and so much of feeling like a success and feeling good about ourselves from all these different places. And it works when one of them doesn't do so great right now, because guess what? We're stable because we've got all these other ones that are going strong. But sometimes life has a way of collapsing all of them at the same time, doesn't it? Whatever reason, when something rains, it also pours. And we can not be doing so great with friendships, and at the same time it's family, and at the same time it's everything else. Or maybe you're just in a place, like many people are in my generation, where you're not married yet, and so that one isn't there, and then you're in this place where you're not a person of faith, and so that one's not there, and what are you left with? Well, the biggest one is work. And so when work doesn't do so great, that's all you got. And everything inside of you feels not good. So you spend all this time and effort, and even when you're not working, you're thinking about it because you don't have a ton else to think about maybe, and it stresses you, and it's always in the head. And so we are bad at resting. But one of the things that I've learned is that it's not just that we're bad at resting our bodies, because we actually have more days off than just about any time in human history. We have more holidays in the year than just about any time in human history. So you would think we would actually feel pretty rested, wouldn't you? But we're not bad at resting our bodies, but we're really bad at resting our souls. And see, that soul is that part of you that you take into every situation you go into. It's that thing that we can lean on when everything else in life collapses because it's internal, it's you, it's inside of you. And the people I know who spent so many years walking with God and building this internal strength, this strong internal soul where it's rested and it's full, those are the people who I've watched go through the struggles in life, and they're almost like, it's okay. I'm good. Like, I know where my heart's at, I know where my soul's at, and I'm okay. So what I want to do is there's 1,000 books out there talking about what it looks like to physically rest. I want to talk about soul rest for the day. And this is something that Jesus talks about in the book of Matthew. In Matthew chapter 11, Jesus says this. He says, "Come to me, all who are weary and burdened." Ever felt weary and burdened? "And I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy, my burden is light." A yoke is a kind of a long, thick piece of wood, which would be uniting two oxen around the neck and connecting to a farming implement, usually a plow, which they would pull along a field to till it and to prepare it for planting. And I guess the idea is here, you got Jesus and you yoked together, and he's saying, hey, I'm a great person to be yoked with because I'm going to pull all the weight. And that's great. And read it, that sounds super encouraging and so great. Here's the problem. It doesn't feel like that sometimes, does it? Ever feel like walking with Jesus isn't easy? Like it's actually pretty difficult and hard and stressful and not as much fun? I mean, this happens in Matthew 11. Let's rewind to the beginning of that chapter. This is the end. In the beginning, we hear about a guy named John the Baptist. If you're familiar with him, you know, he was the guy who was kind of preparing the way of Jesus. And so he knew who Jesus was. He knew what Jesus was about. He's probably one of only a select handful of people, maybe just him and Jesus' parents, who knew that Jesus was the Messiah, who got the picture. He was the first person to publicly say Jesus was the Messiah. Like, he understood what Jesus was about, why he was there. He got the message. He knew what was going on. And in this story, what we find is he's in prison for standing up to the authorities around him, for preaching the truth. And he sends his disciples to talk to Jesus and say, Jesus, are you actually the Messiah? Why would John ask that question? John knows better than perhaps any other person alive that Jesus was the Messiah. Well, John's in prison, and this burden of faith is weighing on him. This fact that he had to stand up to authority, he stood up for truth, and he got thrown in prison for it, and later on goes to get executed. I mean, that's a heavy burden to carry. Jesus, what do you mean your yoke is easy and your burden is light? It was a heavy burden for John the Baptist. If you look at Jesus towards the end of his life, he cries tears of blood at one point. That's a heavy burden. What do you mean this is easy? A lot of scholars will look at that, and what they'll say is yoke was a technical term in those days for a rabbi's teaching. And so it means a set of their teachings, and this is probably accurate that this is what is being talked about in this passage. And so it means, okay, living for Jesus may not be so easy, but Jesus' commandments are easy to follow. And that's true. I mean, I've never sacrificed an animal. In those days, they sacrificed a lot of animals as a part of faith. So that part is a lot easier, right? I've never had to do that, and that's good. But there's other commandments that are much harder to follow. I mean, if we go back to the beginning of this same book, Matthew chapter 5, Jesus is preaching, and he's talking about the Old Testament, and this is what he says. He says, you have heard that it was said to people long ago, meaning in the Old Testament, you shall not murder, and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment. But I tell you that anyone who is angry with a brother or sister will be subject to judgment. I have never murdered somebody. I'm okay comfortably admitting that in front of a room full of people because I never have. I can take that commandment and I can put it in a box and I can label that box, check mark, commandment accomplished, done, no problem, easy commandment to do. The commandment, do not get angry, like, I can't put that in the same box. I fail at that all the time. And then Jesus keeps going, and another passage later, he says, you have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. I've never cheated on a girlfriend. And yet, you ask me, have I ever felt lust in my heart? Of course I have. Everybody has. So what do you mean your commands are easy, Jesus? These are hard. This is difficult. This is way more, even the Pharisees who are famous for being legalistic. Jesus' commands are harder to follow than even theirs. So what do we do with this? What does it mean that Jesus, your burden is easy, your yoke is easy, and your burden is light? What does that mean? And thank goodness that this isn't the end of the story. This is Matthew 11, and then it keeps going into Matthew 12. And Jesus is going to give us a whole story that talks about what it means to rest your souls and how his burden actually is light. He's going to go into this whole story talking about Sabbath, which was the day of rest that the Jewish people took every single week. For them, it happened on Saturdays. We observe it on Sundays. But the idea is that there was this day where you didn't work, and it wasn't just a day off. It was a day where you're supposed to focus on something else. You're supposed to focus on the inside, on the soul, on God, on the eternal realities, not just on the temporary. I've got to work, I've got to do this stuff, right? So 6 days were for the temporary, 1 day was for the eternal, and that was the idea. It was not just a break from something, it was a break for something. And so it's into that Jesus is going to speak and teach us a lot about rest. This is what it says. It says, at that time, Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath. His disciples were hungry and began to pick some heads of grain and eat them. When the Pharisees saw this, they said to him, look, your disciples are doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath. Okay, so the disciples are walking along. They're just picking some heads of grain, getting out the good part, and then they're snacking as they are walking. Now, to us, this may sound like theft. This is not their field after all. It's not. There's actually a law in the Old Testament that says, hey, if you're walking along, you can pluck grains from anybody's fields. What you're not allowed to do is take a farming implement and harvest it. That was the rule. There's a difference between plucking and harvesting. But there was a real rule in the Old Testament that said you can't work on the Sabbath. The Pharisees knew this, and like any good people who are trying to figure out the law, they asked, okay, what counts as work? And that's a very fair question to ask. And in a culture where almost everybody was a farmer, they said no farming. Farming counts as work. And for them, that meant harvesting grain. And they defined it as any kind of plucking. And so they said, you disciples, you are doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath because you are harvesting grain, even just by your fingers. And Jesus doesn't have the same read, and so he's going to give them a response. But he doesn't give a whole complicated legal argument. He gives them an example that is immediately going to cut to the heart. And this is how Jesus responds. He answered, haven't you read what David did when he and his companions were hungry? He entered the house of God, and he and his companions ate the consecrated bread, which was not lawful for them to do, but only for the priests. Or haven't you read in the law that the priests on Sabbath duty in the temple could desecrate the Sabbath and yet are innocent? I tell you that something greater than the temple is here. If you had known what these words mean, I desire mercy, not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the innocent, for the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. I want you to notice a couple things here. Number one, Jesus says he is Lord of the Sabbath. So you might look at this and go, classic Pharisees being legalistic. I'm glad we're not under. No. Jesus is not saying ignore the Sabbath. He's not saying put it in a box of things we don't have to worry about anymore. No. He's saying you need rest. In fact, I'm owning it. I'm calling myself Lord of the Sabbath because this is something that matters. This is something I care about. This is something you need. This is something you need to know that I am emphasizing and I care about. I am Lord of the Sabbath. Notice also his story about David in the Old Testament. This is a story you can read about in the book of Samuel where David, this guy, he's on the run. He's got his men with him, and they're starving. They have no food with them, no provisions, and they stop by at the tabernacle. And in the tabernacle, they got this show bread that only the priests are allowed to eat. And he goes up and he says, I'm hungry. Do you have any bread? And they say, all we have is the show bread. You can eat it. And David eats it and leaves. And there's a big debate. Did the priest do the right thing, giving David the bread or not? And Jesus steps into this and says, absolutely. Because he decided to show mercy. He may not have been following every rule in the holiness code, but he chose compassion. He saw a starving person and he said, I'm going to help. And that matters to God's heart more. And that's a hard thing to combat, right? Because if the Pharisees were to say, you got that one wrong, it would sound like what they're saying is, compassion is not a good thing. Mercy is not a good thing. And they don't want to say that. So Jesus keeps making more points. And he keeps going. We get to the second half of that story. It says this, going on from that place, he went into their synagogue. So same people, you've got the same group of Pharisees. You've now got their congregation that they served over. And a man with a shriveled hand was there. Looking for a reason to bring charges against Jesus, they asked him, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? At the time, it was legal to practice medicine on the Sabbath, but only if it was life or death. So if somebody comes up and you're the town doctor and someone comes up and says, hey, come quick, you were allowed to go and help. You were allowed to serve. You were allowed to heal them. But if it was what we would call an elective surgery or something where you could wait the next day and it wouldn't make a lasting impact, you were required to wait till the next day. This man with the withered hand, the implication is it's going to stay just as withered if it waits one more day. It's not going to get worse. It's going to be what it is. And so the question is, Jesus, you just told this whole story about compassion, but it is illegal to heal on the Sabbath if it's not life or death. And a withered hand in this way is not life or death. But Jesus is known as a healer. He's known as a guy of compassion. And so they're going to trap him. They're going to try to get him to support something that is illegal so that they can arrest him. But Jesus is a theology ninja, and he dodges their attack. And so this is what he says. He said to them, if any of you has a sheep and it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, will you not take hold of it and lift it out? How much more valuable is a person than a sheep? Therefore, it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath. Then he said to the man, stretch out your hand. So he stretched it out, and it was completely restored, just as sound as the other. But the Pharisees went out and plotted how they might kill Jesus. You know, it's an interesting story, and Jesus' example that he gives, it's a good one. Because all the people in the audience were farmers. They had fields, they had sheep, they had animals. And if your animal falls in a pit, you can walk over there and you can pull it out, or you can stand there and you can watch. And you can go, man, that's terrible. But, you know, it's Sabbath, so you got to wait till sundown. I know you're bleeding, I know you're calling out to me and you want me to save you. You got 4 hours, I'm sorry, you're on the clock. Like that was what the Pharisees wanted them to do. At the same time, you know what would have been legal to do if you were worried about danger is you could go stand next to the pit and you could watch the sheep and made sure that no animals came, or nor lions or tigers or whatever. And if they did come, well, now it's life or death. Now you're allowed to do something. So you could have done that. But he says, of course you wouldn't do that. Of course you would get out the sheep. Why? Is it because you can't keep the sheep safe? No, you could do that and keep the Sabbath laws. It's because you got to have compassion. The sheep is in a pit. It's not happy. It's bleeding. It is calling out to you. It is in a difficult situation. Of course you would bring it out. Why would what God wants you to do on the Sabbath be like, man, well, that's a bummer for you, but you got 4 hours to wait. Like, why would that be what God wants? Of course that's not what he wants. So of course he wants you to show compassion on the Sabbath. And so the man reaches out his hand and Jesus heals it, because that's what Jesus was about. Mercy and compassion, even more than the rules. And the Pharisees, they couldn't respond because they were standing in front of a congregation of people who all agreed with Jesus, who all knew that they had done that exact thing before. And so they went out. They couldn't beat him legally, and so they made plots to kill him. So what do we get from this story that was a roundabout, long story about technicalities with the Sabbath and how Jesus looks at it? What does this have to do with the soul, and what does this have to do with rest? What can we pull from it? Well, the first point is this: it emphasizes rest. We need rest. Jesus claims to be Lord of the Sabbath. He owns it. It's something he wants us to do. So we should not go about avoiding rest and avoiding taking a day to be our Sabbath day. It is something that God wants us to do. But Jesus correctly understands the Sabbath. See, what the Pharisees had done is they had done what we frequently do on days off, which is they took all the things, all the expectations of work, and they said, okay, stop doing those, but add these other expectations. Do all these other rules, all these other things that you have to do. So instead of taking a moment to stop and focus on the eternal things that you were supposed to, instead of focusing on the soul, instead of really and truly resting, you just swapped one set of tasks, one set of rules for another set of rules and tasks. And the Sabbath just became about rules and tasks and things. And Jesus says that's not what Sabbath was for. That's not what rest is for. Some of you felt that. We had days off, but the days off were filled with so much expectation and work over the last month, or so much effort, or so much stress, that it really wasn't a day of rest. It was just a day of different work, wasn't it? So how do we rest our souls? And what I love about the story is that Jesus is showing us the right understanding of rest. Rest isn't about external legalities, it's about internal realities. It isn't about external legalities, it's about internal realities. To go back to the example I gave in the beginning, if you're trying to take it easy on the couch eating a bag of Doritos and you don't feel any rest the next morning, there's probably some tension going on the inside that a bag of Doritos didn't fix, which I know is hard to hear because a bag of Doritos can fix a lot, can't it? But some internal realities kept you from resting. Jesus says that's what we need to rest. The Pharisees were so focused on the external rules, the external trappings, that they missed and forgot that it was about the internal. See, the Sabbath rules were originally there to help you focus on the soul, to help you rest your soul. And yet they had made it about the rules themselves. And because of that, they had missed the entire point. And so if I want to go back to how does this mean Jesus' burden is light and his yoke is easy, to go back to that passage earlier from Matthew when it talks about the commandments, when he says do not murder. That's an easy commandment to put a check mark to. But here's the thing. If my heart is ruled by anger, that's not rest. You can't rest while your heart is ruled by anger. You can't sleep, can you? You miss sleep. Because you're thinking about that situation, you're thinking about that problem, you're thinking about that person who hurt you or who you hurt, and you're filled with anger. And because of that, there's no rest. So what does it mean that Jesus yoke is easy? Is it easy to not get angry? No, it's not easy, but it's the only way to rest. It's the only way for your soul to be at peace. When our souls are ruled by anger, when our souls are ruled by lust, as in the other commandment, it destroys us from the inside out, and rest is starved, and our soul starts to wither, and from the inside out, we break down. The Pharisees had it wrong. They thought rest is from the outside in. Jesus says we got to go from the inside out. The internal realities matter. So how do we take care of our internal realities? And I would say it this way. Number one, it's, as I've mentioned, soul rest starts on the inside, which requires that we make some space amongst all the legalities of life for us to focus on the internal realities. We got to go back to that original understanding of Sabbath. The Pharisees, they made it all about the rules. But we've got to look at this thing as something that matters because it shifts us and it builds up our soul. And because if we don't, we break down. And sometimes that does mean rules. Not because the rules are like the Pharisees and it's this big moral thing where you got to do this or, hey, you're going to throw in prison. That's not what it is. Because they're tools to help us set certain things aside so that we can focus on the soul. So I know a lot of people for whom it's this. They don't do social media on Sunday. Why? Is it a sin to do social media on Sunday? No. But why do they do it? Because it's a tool to help us focus on the other things. For other people, it's setting up a regular rhythm of getting up early in the morning to focus on the Lord or reading a Bible or reading a good book. For other people, it's a podcast, it's walking along, it's whatever it looks like for you, so that way you can focus on something going on the inside. You know, it's interesting, Jesus, in the book of Luke, we are told what Jesus does next after this story. Luke records the same story of Jesus on the Sabbath and the fields and all this. And what Jesus does next is he leaves by himself and he goes on a mountainside and he prays through the night. It's interesting to me that he finishes talking about rest and then he leaves and he doesn't rest in the way you and I would think about it, does he? Instead of sleeping, and listen, I'm not saying Jesus is anti-sleep. Jesus napped on a boat in the middle of the storm. Jesus is pro-nap, okay? That's not my problem here. The thing is, sometimes we have to sacrifice something else so that we can rest our souls. And for whatever reason, whatever was going on, Jesus needed to realign and refocus with the Father. And so he took that night and said, the rest for my soul matters more for the rest for my body tonight. And that calculation isn't always easy. I'm not here to prescribe it to you. I'm certainly not saying do that every night. I don't know the realities of every life in the room. There are some times in life where it's like I got to work really hard and not take a break. And man, if I do that for 4 years, then I'll be in a better place and my family will be in a better position. And I get it. That's fair. That happens. That's real. Right? I also get that sometimes in life we're working 3 jobs and there's tension and there's so many things we got to do and it's stress and all the time and then we're also going to night school at the same time and there's so many things and we got to do this to get to a different place and I get it and that's reality too. All I would add to that is this. I think you and I, we would all agree that's not the ideal. It's not where we want to be long term. It's something that over time we want to build out of so that we can build a rhythm of rest, a rhythm of Sabbath into our lives. Martin Luther, famous Protestant reformer, he said this. He said, I have so much to do that I shall spend the first 3 hours in prayer. That's nuts. I don't know about you, but on my busy days, those are not the days that I find myself praying for 3 hours. And yet for Martin Luther, that was exactly the way he thought, because the more tasks that were on his plate, the more he wanted to make sure he was aligned and focused with God, because the more distractions were around him. He wanted to make sure that no matter what was going on in life, his soul was rested. He prioritized the inside. I would also say this, soul rest isn't accidental. It won't just happen. Just because we had a day off doesn't mean our soul's gonna feel better. It's not just not doing something, it is doing something else, focusing on something else, realigning ourselves elsewhere. It doesn't just happen accidentally. It takes work, it takes effort, and sometimes it takes sacrifice, saying no to some stuff so that we can pursue other things. And third, soul rest requires God. It requires us being in communion with our Heavenly Father. When John the Baptist doubted in the beginning of this story and his disciples come, Jesus' response is not one of condemnation. John, you know better. John did know better. That wasn't Jesus' response, though. His response was, watch, look at all the miracles I'm doing. Only Messiah could do this. It was one of kindness, gentleness, humility. Notice that in the story when the disciples are plucking grain, you know what I would have done in that situation? I would have gone to the disciples and I would have said, hey guys, listen, you're right, you totally can pick the grain, but can we just get out of eyesight first? So that way, we don't turn this into a whole thing when it's just grain. That's what I would have done. You know what Jesus does? He goes to the mat for his disciples' right to snack. That's somebody I want on my team who's going to stand up for my right to have a snack when I'm hungry and is willing to face death threats for that. That's pretty crazy, but that's who I want caring for my soul. Notice also the guy with the withered hand. He could have waited until sundown, healed the guy's hand, and the guy would have still been ecstatic because finally his hand was healed. But that's not what Jesus does. Jesus says, you're not waiting another hour. It's happening now. And that was what kicked off the whole, we need to kill Jesus plot. Jesus didn't have to do that, but he did because he has a heart of compassion and not wanting them to go any further than any further than he had to, suffering like that. Jesus is filled with compassion. God is merciful. Who else would we want to commune with to find rest for our souls? And speaking of it requiring God, I would encourage everybody to do this as you go home. Pull out your phone, pull out Google, and just Google Christian spiritual disciplines. You'll find all kinds of lists of practices and ideas of things that we can do to help us connect with God and to focus on God. Some of them won't surprise you, things like journaling, things like go for a prayer walk, things like just think about it, take a second where you're unplugged and you're just thinking, spend a moment of silence where you're just trying to listen, and not for 5 minutes, for like an hour or two. There are all kinds of spiritual disciplines out there talking. Fasting is one. So we don't talk about fasting, but the whole idea is not that you are a better person because you follow this rule of fasting. The whole idea is when you feel hungry, it reminds you to pray. And you don't do it for very long because that's bad for the body, but you do it for a time, and it invites you to remind yourself to pray. And you will find all kinds of spiritual disciplines that are going to help you in those moments when you're taking a break from something else, fill with something else so that we can find rest for our souls and find ourselves in a different place when we encounter the difficulties and the struggles of life. Soul rest starts on the inside. It's not accidental, and it requires relational connection with God. Because all of those things go to the internal realities of who we are, which helps us better face the external legalities of life. Let me pray. Dear God, I thank you for this morning. God, I hope that in this room there are so many people who have found the holidays to be a restful season, but I know that that's probably not true of everybody. But God, I do pray that this can be a year, 2024 can be a year where our souls are able to rest in you because of your care, your love, and your providence for us, God, that we can rest in you. We can turn to you. We can carve out time and effort and energy for you because it is in you that our souls rest and find peace. In your name I pray, amen.